In this video, I'll go over the steps I use to make some windows for the hardtop that I built for this Miata. It uses the stock Miata convertible top frame as a structure for the hardtop, and then allows you to reuse all the gaskets, the stock original gaskets, for hopefully good sealing. And then I added an additional gasket under the back of the top. The situation I have on the Miata is I built this headrest behind the driver's seat in the style of a 50s Italian race car. And after driving the car some, I've decided it's so much fun to drive that I would like to be able to drive it the rest of the year. So I started the hardtop and built the hardtop, but I would like to be able to switch back and forth between having the open cockpit with the headrest and having the hardtop. So the way I will mount the hardtop is with some tapped plates that I will rivet in place into this tonneau area. The tapped plate looks like so. It's a thicker piece of aluminum. I'm going to rivet a series of these plates in place using countersunk screws, countersunk rivet. So when it's done, the head will sit flush and should look pretty nice. I'll just have to put some bolts or something in to fill up those holes so that it looks okay when the hardtop is not on. Here with a little higher vantage point, I'm hoping it will show what needs to happen here. I have spring-loaded temporary rivets called clecos that are holding these in place, these tapped plates. They're not tapped yet, but after I rivet them, I will tap them. That will mean that if they shift, it's not such a big deal. So I remove the clecos that are holding these in place. I have a drill with a countersink. I prepare each hole to receive the little countersunk rivet with a deep enough pocket. When I set this rivet, it will finish out pretty cleanly. Here's how I went about laying out the windows. On the inside of the roof, I made a paper pattern of where I felt like the window ought to go. Then I clecoed from the inside of the roof the paper pattern to the metal. I removed the paper pattern, cut out the silhouette, transferred it to the outside of the panel and held it with clecos, drew around the outside, cut it out with a jigsaw, and then transferred the panel to the other side and was able to find the same location and cut out the other side. And then I just need to cut out a center window right here. The materials I'll need to make these windows a reality will include some Tough-Ack polycarbonate sheet. I would have preferred to use something about 1/8 of an inch thick, but because I'm not a mathematologist, I ordered a gasket to go around the edge for thicker material, so I'm going to go with the thicker material. It'll probably be a little bit harder to shape. I need a home-built oven that will allow me to reach the optimum temperature, which is about 325 degrees. Through a lot of R&D, I determined that from about 310 to about 330 degrees, the polycarbonate shapes like a dream, but at about, so for example, it's quite flexible in a certain temperature range, but then at about 350, it starts to overheat and develop air bubbles and whatnot, and so it's can be rather challenging on a homemade operation like this to find and stay at the optimum temperature. I also need a form to shape the Lexan over, so I'm using the pieces of aluminum that I cut out of the Miata hardtop. I made a mold for the bottom side of the Lexan, which I reinforced, and then I made a top piece out of 18 gauge steel that when the Lexan is hot, I'll clamp this sandwich together as quickly as possible, and as soon as it cools, I should have a usable window. This view underneath shows how the aluminum that I cut out of my Miata hardtop has been reinforced and clamped to the structure so it's very stable and rigid, and then it'll hopefully serve as a good mold for the Lexan while it's hot and pliable. The first window I cut it to pretty much the finished size. I heated it in my homemade oven, and as you can see, it got too hot around here. This is about 350 degrees, unfortunately, so that's junk. Another critical tool is an infrared thermometer to be able to register the heat of the surface as opposed to just the heat of the oven. I found, depending on the thickness of the material, I would get very different surface temperatures based on just the heat of the oven. I have a thermometer mounted to the top of this, and at 425 degrees as measured from the thermometer at the top of the oven, the surface of the polycarbonate was about 325, with an 1/8 inch material, which is this thick. It was much closer. The air temperature at about 350 would be about 325 on the surface, so I guess the point of that is to just emphasize it varies a lot, and you really have to have a way to check the surface and then check all of the areas on the surface. I'm hoping that if I do another piece and leave extra around the sides, that even if the edge gets a little overheated, I can trim it off and still get something usable. Another point worth mentioning is how you really need to protect the surface of the Lexan or polycarbonate when it's in the oven. I have a piece of plywood wrapped with cotton from a big canvas tarp. Otherwise, of course, the surface of the polycarbonate is pretty soft as it gets heated, and it will get marked up a lot. This seems to have worked well and stands up to 425 degrees thus far. I've also had to diffuse the heat in the oven just with random pieces of metal. I have more scrap underneath here and you can see that got a little scorching there at one point, but as I mentioned earlier, lots of R&D went into finding a system that would heat it reasonably evenly. I'm still, have yet to prove this, but hopefully the next piece is going to be the winner. But you can see there's a shield here to help diffuse the heat from the heat lamps. Without this shield on here, of course the polycarbonate would get super hot right under the lamps, and then also this would probably be much better if I had more space between my heat source and my material that I'm working with, but live and learn. I'm sure each iteration will get a little bit better. To cut my polycarbonate, I just used a jigsaw and these blades that say intended for plexiglass, 14 teeth per inch. It seems to work really, really well. I've not had any trouble cutting very cleanly with this combination. I'm a little worried I didn't get it quite hot enough. I had checking the temperature with the infrared thermometer. The outer edge was about 335 right here, and it's just barely starting to bubble. I had about 330 over on this side. I had about 300 right in the middle, and it seems like it really needs to be more about 310. 325 is ideal, but anyway, we'll take the clamp off. Let's see where we are. Oh, whoopsie. I think it would be fine, except I chomped into it with my vice grip. Not good. Otherwise, I would be usable. I cut it a little bit oversized in case the edges got too hot, but I don't think I cut it that much oversized. Rats. Because of course each time you do this it costs you about 25 bucks for each attempt. But back to the drawing board. The first attempt was a miserable failure. Let's see how the second attempt went. Looks very promising. We'll do a quick check on the body. Yeah, I think once I trim that down a little bit, that'll be fine. The way I plan to secure it is with a gasket that the thin part goes on the metal of the top. The Lexan or polycarbonate fits in this little trough, and then once the glass is in there, it gets trapped. The gasket traps the material like so. We'll see how that does. After a huge struggle, I finally got the window mounted. I think it was probably harder than building the whole car, but yeah, it took about 2 hours struggling with that gasket. The gasket requires about 5/16 of clearance around the outer edge of the polycarbonate, which I clearanced using a flap disc on an electric grinder that worked really well for removing material cleanly. One other thing, this particular gasket specified that the minimum radius on the corners was 3 inches, which I foolishly had already cut sharper than 3 inches, so I had to come back and weld more metal in to soften these corners so they were less severe, and then I just retrimmed the corners, and there we have one of 3 windows. Here are the completed windows. After the agony I experienced on this first window with my homemade oven, I used the kitchen oven for the other 2 windows. It was way easier. I had to change the maximum size of my middle window, which previously had come out to about here, because the oven would only fit a certain size, so I just shrank down the size of the windows to fit the oven. I made 2-piece forms just like I did with the first window, and it was just a whole lot easier. The heat was much more even. I still use my infrared thermometer to judge the surface temp, but that all went very smoothly. I left the appropriate gap, I think it was about 5/16 around the outside, and those went in without too much trouble. So it turned out okay.